"Cowboy, don't look. My dress is gone," whispered the Apache woman from behind the veil of the waterfall. But before we fully step into that moment, let's set the scene. Mason Hale reached the mouth of the canyon just as the afternoon sun began to dip, turning the red rock walls into radiating ovens. The heat out here wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical weight, heavier than the open plains he'd left behind that morning. He'd been riding hard since first light, pausing only when necessary to check his gear and let his mare, Bramble, catch her breath. Mason was a horse trader by trade, a drifter by necessity. He spent his life moving between scattered settlements, never staying in one place long enough for the dust to settle on his boots. This particular trip, however, carried a heavier burden. He was driving 2 mares to a rancher north of the canyon, banking on the payment to keep him fed and supplied for the coming winter. Money was always tight, but for Mason, solitude was the real currency. He avoided towns, crowds, and questions. Questions usually led to his past, and his past was a ghost he preferred not to resurrect. Years ago, Mason had ridden with a scout regiment patrolling the volatile frontier lines. One bad call during a midnight raid had led to lost lives that still haunted his quiet moments. Since then, he kept his head down and his circle small. The canyon, with its twisting paths and profound silence, was exactly the kind of country he liked. It didn't ask anything of him. He guided Bramble toward a small, hidden oasis he'd discovered on a previous run. A modest waterfall spilled into a shaded pool here, one of the only reliable water sources for miles. As the sound of falling water grew louder, Mason's instincts kicked in. He slowed the mare, his eyes scanning the dirt for fresh prints, disturbed brush, or anything that suggested company. The ground looked clear, relieved. He swung down from the saddle. The air temperature dropped noticeably near the water, a welcome respite. He loosened Bramble's bridle to let her drink and wiped the grit from his brow, looking forward to a few minutes of peace. But as he knelt to fill his canteen, a sound cut through the rhythmic splashing of the waterfall. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't his horse. It was a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Mason froze. You don't survive years as a scout by ignoring the small things. His hand didn't go for his gun, but it hovered near the holster, hovering in that dangerous space between calm and violence. He stood up slowly, scanning the canyon rim. Nothing. The sound had come from behind the curtain of water. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice level and commanding. For a long heartbeat, there was only the sound of the water. Then a voice trembled through the mist. "Don't look at me. Please, I need help." The desperation in her voice hit him harder than a threat would have. This wasn't an ambush, it was fear. Mason stepped back, making a show of giving the waterfall space. "Tell me what you need," he replied. "The current, it took my clothing," she stammered. "I have nothing to cover myself." Mason understood immediately. Without a word, he unbuckled his heavy duster coat. He walked over to a flat, sun-warmed rock near the pool's edge and laid the coat down gently. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, letting his boots scuff the stone so she could hear exactly where he was. "The coat is on the rock," he said, backing away to stand by Bramble. "Take your time. I'm not looking." Movement stirred behind the water. A moment later, a figure emerged. She was young, likely in her mid-20s, clutching his coat around her frame with a white-knuckled grip. Her long black hair was soaked, plastering against her shoulders. Mason kept his gaze respectful, looking no higher than her face. He could see the exhaustion etched there, the kind that comes from running until your lungs burn. "I'm Mason Hale," he said softly. "Are you hurt?" "My name is Asha," she replied, her voice gaining a little strength. She hesitated, then shifted her weight. "My foot. I hit a rock jumping from the path above." Mason glanced down. Her ankle was already swelling, a dark bruise forming against the skin. "It's bad, but it's not broken," he assessed from a distance. "You can walk, but it won't be fast." Asha nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the canyon entrance. "They chased me in here," she whispered. Mason's demeanor shifted instantly. "Who raiders?" she said. "I don't know how many. They scattered. My group." I ran until the sound stopped. Mason listened to the canyon. It was quiet now, but raiders were like wolves. They could move silently when they hunted. The delivery job, the money, the schedule, it all evaporated. Leaving her here wasn't an option. I know a place, Mason said, making a decision that would change his course entirely. An old hunter's shelter not far from here. We need to get you out of the open. Asterisk. You take the lead, Mason offered, his voice low and reassuring. I'll stay a few paces back. You set the speed. Asha took a deep, steadying breath and nodded. All right. They moved away from the pool, leaving the sanctuary of the water behind. Asha's steps were cautious, her body tense as if she expected the ground to give way beneath her. Mason matched her pace perfectly, his boots making almost no sound on the canyon floor. Every few moments, Asha glanced over her shoulder. It wasn't that she was afraid of him specifically. Mason realized it was that her body hadn't yet unlearned the panic of being hunted. As they wound deeper into the canyon, the roar of the waterfall faded into a distant hum, replaced by the dry scrape of sand and the hollow whistling of wind through the stone crevices. Mason watched her struggle. She favored her good leg, trying to hide the limp, but he noticed every flinch. He didn't say anything, though. He knew from experience that acknowledging the pain often made it harder to keep moving. Instead, he kept his distance close enough to intervene if she fell, but far enough back to give her the illusion of freedom. Why were you traveling through here? Mason asked after a while, keeping his tone conversational to distract her. My family was moving camps, she answered, her voice tight. We tried to stay off the main trails to avoid conflict, but trouble found us anyway. Mason didn't press for more. The way she said it told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't hiding anything malicious, just the heavy grief of a survivor. His mind churned as they walked. He hadn't signed up for this. He avoided responsibility like a plague, preferring the uncomplicated company of horses to the messy problems of people. But walking away from a woman left with nothing in the middle of a raid wasn't something he could square with his conscience. Like it or not, he was committed now. Ahead, the train began to level out into a shallow basin. Asha slowed, squinting against the glare. She pointed a trembling hand toward a cluster of brush near a stone rise. Is that it? The shelter, that's the place, Mason confirmed. We're almost there. Asha let out a breath that was half sigh, half sob. The relief in her posture was immediate. They walked into the basin, where the canyon walls widened, offering a bit more sky. Mason signaled for a brief halt. Take a minute, he said. Asha sank onto a flat rock, pulling his oversized coat tightly around her legs. Her wet hair clung to the wool, dampening it, and she shivered as the adrenaline began to crash. Mason stood a few yards away, scanning the rim of the canyon, his eyes never resting in one spot. How long were you running? He asked gently. Since morning, she replied, wiping a bead of water from her cheek. I thought I could lose them in the rocks, but the canyon got confusing. By the time I hit the water, I didn't know which way was north. Did anyone else make it? She shook her head, looking down at her hands. It happened so fast. I lost sight of everyone when the fires started. A familiar, heavy ache settled in Mason's chest. He knew that look, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had watched their world burn. In mere minutes, he remembered the feeling of helplessness from his scouting days, watching innocent families scatter while chaos reigned. It was that memory that rooted his boots to the ground beside her. Asha watched him as he checked the horizon. You listen to everything, she observed softly. Habit, Mason muttered, keeps you above ground. She studied him for a long moment, measuring him. She saw the caution etched into the lines of his face, the way he stood ready for a fight that hadn't started yet. Why do you travel alone? She asked. Work, he said simply. Trading horses keeps me fed, and moving keeps me occupied. Occupied from what? Mason hesitated. He stared out at the harsh, beautiful landscape through the canyon opening. From things I don't want following me, he finally said. That she didn't push. She seemed to understand that some ghosts didn't need names. Come on, Mason said, nodding toward the rise. Let's get you under a roof. The climb to the shelter was short but steep. Asha struggled with her footing, her bruised ankle protesting the uneven ground. Mason stepped up beside her, not grabbing her arm, but positioning himself as a living rail she could lean on if she stumbled. She didn't reach out, but she stayed close to his shadow. At the top of the rise, the old hunter's shelter revealed itself. It was humble, a rough structure of stacked stone and timber, half hidden by overgrown brush. The roof sagged to the right, and the entrance was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. But to Asha, it looked like a castle. No one's inside, Mason said, eyeing the dust at the threshold. It's been empty a long time. It's better than being out here, she whispered. Mason nodded and moved toward the entrance. He didn't walk straight in. Instead, he approached from the side, weapon hand-free. Checking the corners, Asha watched him, realizing fully now that this man wasn't just a traitor. He moved like a soldier. Only when he was absolutely certain did he turn to her and give a sharp nod. Safe. Asha stepped across the threshold, pulling the oversized coat tighter around her frame. Inside, the air was dry and still, carrying the faint, dusty scent of old wood smoke and earth, the smell of a place that had been waiting for someone to return. The rough-hewn logs and stacked stone walls seemed to hold onto the last dregs of daylight, leaving the interior dim but protective. She moved deeper into the room, leaning back against the cool stone wall. For the first time in hours, the frantic drumming of her heart began to slow. Mason followed, dropping his saddlebags near the entrance. He didn't just dump them, he placed them strategically, creating a small barricade while keeping his line of sight clear to the door. It wasn't a conscious decision anymore, it was muscle memory. He pulled a bundle of dry brush from one of the bags and crouched by the old fire pit. In the center of the room, he tested the charred remains of previous fires, finding a few pieces of wood that were still sound enough to burn. Asha watched him work. There was a mesmerizing precision to his movements. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. He arranged the kindling with the focus of a man who knew that a fire was sometimes the only friend you had in the dark. You've built a few of these in your time, she murmured, breaking the silence. More than I care to count, Mason replied, his voice low. Asha found a low stone ledge built into the back wall and sat down, tucking her legs up beneath the coat to conserve body heat. The heavy wool shielded her from the air, but the dampness of her skin underneath made her shiver uncontrollably. She rubbed her arms, trying to friction away the chill. Seeing the tremor in her shoulders, Mason nudged the kindling deeper into the pit and struck a match. The flame caught instantly, hungrily licking at the dry wood. A warm, amber glow bloomed in the center of the room, pushing back the shadows. The light caught Asha's face, revealing the stark lines of exhaustion and the guarded look in her eyes that even the warmth couldn't quite melt. Mason fed a few thicker branches into the flames, building the heat gradually. Once he was satisfied it would hold, he sat back on his heels, keeping a respectful distance. The fire crackled, a domestic sound that seemed to smooth over the raw edges of the tension between them. Asha let out a long, shaky breath. She pressed the sole of her injured foot against the wall, testing it. A wince flickered across her face. How bad is the pain? Mason asked, watching her. It's manageable, she lied, though her voice was thin. I've walked on worse. It was the answer of someone who had learned that complaining rarely fixed anything. You need to keep weight off it tonight, Mason advised gently, pushing it. Now we'll just make us stationary tomorrow. She didn't argue. Silence stretched between them again, but it was less heavy now. The fire was doing its work, warming the stone and the air. Why were you out here alone? She asked eventually, her curiosity cutting through her fatigue. Mason stared into the flames, debating how much truth to offer. Work, he said finally, delivering stock. It keeps me moving, keeps me away from places I don't want to see again. What kind of places? He paused. Old forts, camps where I used to work. There are too many ghosts in those towns. Asha studied his profile, noting the grim set of his jaw. People you lost, people I failed to protect, he corrected, his tone flat and final. Asha didn't press him. She understood that kind of weight. She knew what it felt like to survive when others hadn't, and the guilt that followed you like a shadow. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the canyon gaps, but inside, the fire snapped and popped, a small circle of defiance against the night. No one is coming in here tonight, Mason said, sensing her eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. I checked the trail behind us. The sand was clean. We're ghosts to them right now. Thank you, she whispered, for checking. She shifted, trying to get comfortable on the hard stone. When the raiders hit, we had minutes, she said, her voice staring into the fire. They came from the south ridge. I didn't even see faces. Just torches. You did what you had to do, Mason said. I left everything, she murmured. My home, my things, everything I knew. Mason tossed another stick onto the fire. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He knew that it will be okay. It was a lie people told to make themselves feel better. Instead, he offered the only truth that mattered right now. You're breathing. He said simply, that means you beat them today. Asha looked at him then, really looked at him. The firelight danced in her eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped out from behind that waterfall, her shoulders dropped. The rigid tension left her body. Mason leaned back against the wall by the door, one leg extended, settling in to watch the entrance. He saw the shift in her. She wasn't running anymore. And looking across the small, firelit room, he realized with a start that, for tonight at least, neither was he. Night settled fully over the canyon, heavy and absolute. By the time the fire stabilized into a steady, pulsing glow, it cast shifting lines of amber across the rough stone walls. Asha had finally stopped shivering, her body slowly accepting the warmth that circulated through the small room. But exhaustion clung to her. Her eyelids would droop, heavy with sleep, only to snap open again the moment a distant sound drifted in a shifting rock. The rustle of brush, anything that disrupted. The silence. Even in safety, her body remembered the chase. Mason sat near the entrance, one knee raised, his back braced against the sturdy log frame. To a casual observer, his posture might have looked relaxed, but Asha could see the truth in the set of his shoulders. He was coiled tight. Every few minutes, he tilted his head slightly, filtering the sounds of the night, separating the natural rhythm of the canyon from the threat of human movement. Years of scouting had sharpened him. He didn't just hear the silence, he read it. Asha shifted on the stone ledge, pulling the heavy coat closer to her neck. Do you stay awake this late every night? She asked quietly, her voice rough from the day's terror. Most nights, Mason answered, not looking away from the dark beyond the door. It's a hard habit to break. She studied him in the flickering firelight. She noticed the deep lines near his eyes, the way his hand hovered casually near his belt always, within reach of his weapon. He wasn't tense in a panicked way. He was tense the way a loaded spring is tense, ready. You don't trust the dark, she said. He considered that for a moment. I trust it to hide things that shouldn't be seen, he replied. But I prefer to know what's looking back at me. Asha kept her gaze on him for several seconds. She was trying to understand the man who had stepped into her danger without asking for a name. I used to sleep easily, she said softly, before the raids started coming closer to our camps. After that, every noise sounded like an ending. You're safe, right? Now, Mason said. It wasn't a promise, just a calm observation. There are no tracks at the entrance. The wind is covering our scent, and the mare outside she'll hear a lizard cross the sand before we do. She nodded, finding comfort in the certainty of his tone rather than false hope. Do you think the raiders will keep searching? They scatter once they lose sight of the target, he answered. They don't waste time doubling back unless they have a reason. You made it away. To them, the trail is cold. They've likely moved on. Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying sand across the entrance in small, scraping waves. Asha eased onto her back, testing how much her ankle would tolerate the movement. Pain flashed briefly across her face before she steadied herself. Mason noticed the strain immediately. Raise your foot a little, he suggested, nodding toward a flat stone near her. It'll take the pressure off. She adjusted carefully, placing the stone under her heel. The relief was slow but noticeable. Thank you, she murmured. He returned his attention to the entrance, eyes scanning the faint moonlight bleeding through the cracks. You asked earlier about the places I left behind, he said, breaking the quiet. Fort towns, scout camps, that life that breaks a person down if they stay too long. Why did you stay as long as you did? She asked. Duty, he replied, though. The words sounded bitter, or what I thought was duty. But when a call goes wrong, it follows you. You don't forget the faces, you carry them with you, she whispered. Every day, he said, his voice low but steady. Asha lowered herself again. Drawing the coat over her shoulders, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She knew they wouldn't land right. Instead, she offered acknowledgement. You helped me today, she said quietly. That counts for something. Mason didn't respond, but she saw a faint shift in his posture, a small release in the rigid line of his shoulders. The fire popped once, sending a small ember drifting upward before it faded. Asha's breathing gradually slowed, settling into a rhythm that suggested she was finally surrendering to sleep. Mason stayed awake. He watched over her as the fire dimmed, his presence steady and unmoving. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in the dark, and surprisingly, it didn't feel like a burden. A faint gray light crept into the shelter long before the sun cleared the canyon ridge. Mason was already awake, or rather, he had never truly slept sitting against the entrance frame, with his arms resting loosely over his knees. Asha stirred on the stone ledge. Her fingers tightened briefly round the coat before she remembered where she was. Her eyes fluttered open, assessing the dim room, grounding herself in the warmth of the dying fire. When she finally sat up, she looked at Mason with a mixture of confusion and recognition. You stayed awake all night, she said, her voice raspy. I rested enough, Mason replied, standing up and brushing dust from his pants. Didn't want anything catching us off guard. Asha studied him in the soft morning light. He looked tired, but it was a mental weariness, not physical. She wondered how many nights he had spent like this before their paths crossed. You didn't have to watch alone, she said. I know, he answered, but you needed the sleep more than I did. Outside, the air was warmer than the night had been. Asha tested her ankle, placing her foot on the ground carefully. The ache was sharp, at first, but not unbearable. She exhaled, relieved she could put weight on it. Still sore? Mason asked, watching her adjust her stance. Less than last night, she said. I can walk. We don't have the luxury to stay here long, he reminded her gently. He crouched near the fire pit, breaking apart the remaining embers and covering them with dirt until the ground looked untouched. He moved with the care of a man who left no trace. Where will you go after this? She asked. North, he said. I still have horses to deliver, and after that, depends on where the road leads. Asha stood, pulling the coat around her. Why? Did you help me? She asked suddenly. Many men would have kept riding. Mason met her gaze steadily, pausing in his work. Because you needed someone to stop. Her throat tightened at the simplicity of his answer. She wasn't used to kindness without expectation. It unsettled her, but in a way that felt like hope. We'll search upstream first, Mason said, moving toward the door. Hunters usually work close to water. We need to find you something to wear before we travel far. Asha nodded, stepping out into the daylight behind him. Lead the way. They moved upstream, their footsteps falling into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Asha no longer checked over her shoulder every few seconds. Mason's presence, steady and alert, seemed to absorb the need for her constant vigilance. We'll check. Near the boulder cluster, Mason said, pointing toward a bend in the canyon wall. Hunters usually leave their tanning racks where the wind can dry the hides. He was right. Tucked away in the shadow of the rocks, they found the skeletal remains of an old camp. It was little more than a pile of debris, now a broken wooden frame, a length of stiffened cord, and a few discarded scraps of hide that had been deemed too imperfect to trade. Asha knelt beside the pile, her hands moving over the rough leather with a practiced, tactile intelligence. She pulled a piece of hide, testing its tensile strength, then found another that was softer. I can work with this, she said, looking up. I've made clothing from worse. Mason watched her, noting the shift in her demeanor. The fear was receding, replaced by a focused competence. You know how to scavenge, he observed. Most people would see trash here. That comes from years of walking alone, she replied, her voice carrying a hard edge of truth. You learn to see value where others don't. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather. Surviving isn't the same as living, Mason. The words hung in the dry air between them. Mason felt the weight of them settle in his chest. "And you?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "Have you been living?" Mason adjusted the strap of his bag, looking out toward the horizon. "I've been moving," he answered honestly. "Whether that counts as living, I'm not sure." Asha held his gaze. For a beat longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "We keep going," she said softly, "both of us." They returned to the shelter as the sun climbed to its zenith, baking the canyon floor. The afternoon unfolded with a kind of domestic industry that felt strangely natural. Asha spread the scavenged hides across a flat stone, using a sharp flake of flint to cut them into panels. Her fingers moved with steady precision, punching holes and threading the leather strips. Mason didn't sit idle. He took a small hatchet from his gear and set to work repairing the sagging roof of the shelter. He trimmed the rot from the beams and secured loose stones. The rhythmic thud-thud of the hatchet against wood became a heartbeat for their temporary camp, a sound that told Asha she was guarded. She found herself watching him in the quiet moments. He worked with a surprising economy of motion. He didn't hack at the wood. He shaped it. "You treat things gently," she noted aloud. Mason paused mid-swing, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not always," he said, looking at his rough hands. "But I'm trying." "It shows," she said. "Most men force things to fit. You make room for them." The heat of the day pressed down, and Mason stopped to fetch the waterskin from the mare. Bringing it to Asha, she accepted it without flinching, a small victory. Hours ago, his proximity would have made her brace for a blow. Now, she drank deeply and handed the skin back with a nod. "You're getting your color back," Mason commented. "I'm feeling more like myself," she admitted. "It's amazing what a little safety does." "It's not just safety," Mason said. "It's healing." Asha resumed her sewing. "Healing doesn't happen just because the danger stops," she said quietly. "It starts when someone treats you like you matter." Mason looked at her, really looked at her. "You matter," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty he used to read a trail. By late afternoon, the dress was finished. It was rough, a patchwork of scavenged leather, but it was sturdy. Asha retreated into the shelter to change. Emerging moments later, she adjusted the tie at her waist, running her hands down the stiff fabric. It wasn't elegant, but it was armor. "It fits," she said, looking for his reaction. "Not perfect, but it will do." "It's good work," Mason replied, his voice sincere. "You look ready for what? For whatever comes next." As the sun began to dip toward the western ridge, cooling the air, Mason gathered his tools. The shelter looked better than it had when they arrived, sturdier, cleaner. "We should move tomorrow," he said, the reality of their situation returning. This place served its purpose, but staying too long risks drawing eyes. Asha nodded, the resolve on her face hardening. "I trust your judgment. We'll leave at dawn," he decided. "I'll be ready," she replied. They stood together outside the shelter as twilight bruised the sky purple and gold. It was the first day they had worked side by side, not as rescuer and victim, but as partners. The shift was undeniable. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by bad luck anymore. They were a team. And as the stars began to prick the canopy above, the silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken trust. The evening settled over the canyon with a heavier quiet than the night before, the kind of silence that comes when the adrenaline fades and leaves you alone with your thoughts. The sun dipped behind the far ridge, washing the stone walls in fading violet and gray before the shadows finally swallowed them whole. Asha stepped out of the shelter, adjusting the fit of the leather dress she had stitched together. It was stiff and crude compared to the woven cotton she was used to, but it was warm, and more importantly, it was hers. She sat on a rock near the fire pit, stretching her injured leg out. The cool air felt good against the throbbing heat in her ankle. Mason was already there, crouching beside a small tin pot balanced over the flames. He stirred the water, adding a pinch of dried herbs from his saddlebag. "You're moving better," he observed, not looking up from the fire. "It still hurts," she admitted, "but it's a pain I can walk on. I won't hold us up. You don't have to prove anything to me," Mason said gently. He poured the steaming broth into a cup and handed it to her. "Drink. It's not a feast, but it'll warm you up." Asha took the cup with both hands, letting the steam rise against her face. "You worry a lot for a man who claims he just wants to be left alone." Mason sat back on his heels, poking the fire with a stick. "I've lost enough people to know that being careless costs more than just time." Asha lowered the cup, studying his face in the flickering light. The shadows seemed to deepen the lines around his eyes. "People close to you. People I rode with." He answered, his voice low. "Men I was supposed to lead. I made a call once, a shortcut I thought was safe. I was wrong. Good men paid for that mistake, and you've been punishing yourself ever since." Asha said softly, "Blame is a hard thing to outrun." He muttered, "It rides faster than any horse." "You stopped for me," she pointed out. "A man who didn't care, a man who was truly empty. He would have kept riding. You didn't." Mason looked at her then. He didn't deny it, but he didn't accept the absolution either. He just nodded once, acknowledging the point. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling and popping, creating a small sphere of safety in the vast darkness. Asha set her empty cup down. Her expression grew serious. "I need to tell you something, Mason, about the raid." He shifted, his attention fully to her. "Go on. It wasn't random," she said, her voice tightening. "They didn't just stumble upon us. They were following a specific track. They knew exactly where the sentries were posted, and they came straight for the families." Mason's jaw tightened. "You think someone sold you out?" "I know they did," she replied, "which means they might not be scattered. If they were tracking us specifically, they could be combing these canyons right now looking for survivors." The implication hung heavily in the air. This wasn't just a matter of avoiding bandits. It was about evading hunters. "That changes things," Mason said, his tone shifting from reflective to practical. "If they're tracking, they'll check the main water sources. That's why I can't slow you down," she said, fear creeping back into her eyes. "If they find my trail, they won't." Mason cut in firmly. "We leave at first light. I know paths through this rock that aren't on any map. By the time they check this canyon, we'll be miles north." Asha looked at him, searching for doubt and finding none. She shifted closer to the fire, shivering slightly as the wind picked up. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his wrist as she sought the warmth of the fire. The contact surprised them both. She pulled her hand back quickly. "I didn't mean." "It's fine," Mason said softly. He didn't pull away. He sat still, letting her see that he wasn't afraid of her closeness. "I'm not used to being near anyone," she confessed. "Not since the running started." "Neither am I," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out." The tension in Asha's shoulders finally began to unspool. Mason returned to his post near the door as the fire burned down to embers. Asha retreated into the shelter, lying down on the stone ledge. "Will you sleep at all?" she asked into the darkness. "Eventually," he said. "Rest, Asha. I've got the watch." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her sleep wasn't fitful. It was deep, anchored by the knowledge that someone was standing between her and the dark. Dawn broke over the ridge like a slow exhale, the light spilling into the canyon in thin, pale ribbons. The air held a crisp, biting chill, sharper than the previous morning. Waking the world with a cold touch, Asha woke to the familiar, rhythmic scrape of Mason's boots against stone. As he returned from his morning perimeter check, he ducked through the low entrance, brushing dust from his gloves. "The ground is quiet," he reported, his voice low in the stillness. "Old tracks, nothing fresh. If anyone was hunting last night, they didn't come this way." Asha sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The ache in her ankle greeted her immediately, a dull, throbbing reminder of the chase, but it wasn't the sharp, stabbing pain of yesterday. She stood carefully, testing her weight. It held. "I can walk," she said, tightening the belt of her leather dress. "We need to cover ground before the sun gets high," Mason said, moving to prep the mare. "I'll take the lead. The path gets narrow up ahead. Just keep my back in sight." They stepped out into the morning light. The canyon felt vast and imposing, a labyrinth of red stone and shadow. Mason led Bramble with a steady hand, picking a line through the loose scree and scrub brush. Asha followed, her eyes glued to the path he chose, stepping exactly where he stepped. After an hour of silent trekking, the claustrophobia of the canyon began to weigh on her. "If I were still alone," she said, breaking the silence, "I don't think I would have left that shelter." Mason didn't turn around, but his pace slowed just a fraction. "You're not alone," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." The words weren't delivered with grandeur. They were spoken like a simple fact, as reliable as the ground beneath their boots. By mid-morning, the terrain began to change. The towering walls of the canyon finally gave way, opening up onto a rising slope that led to a high ridge. When they crested the top, the world expanded. A vast, rolling wilderness stretched out before them, wild and unbroken. Mason paused, scanning the horizon with squinted eyes. "See that line of cottonwoods?" He pointed to a ribbon of green in the distance. "There's a stream there. We'll water the mare and rest at midday." Asha stood beside him, catching her breath. "You know this land better than anyone I've met." "I've ridden these trails every season for 5 years," Mason replied. "Running horses north, you learn the safe paths the hard way." "And the unsafe ones?" she asked. Mason's expression darkened slightly. "Lost a good man to a flash flood in the lower gulch," he said quietly. "Lost another to an ambush near the pass. Since then, I don't take risks I can't calculate." Asha watched him. "You carry a lot of ghosts, Mason." "So do you," he countered softly. They moved down the slope, the path narrowing between two jagged outcrops. At one point, Asha stumbled on a loose rock. Instinctively reaching out to steady herself, her hand grabbed Mason's arm. He didn't flinch or pull away. He simply braced himself, offering her a solid anchor until she regained her footing. "You all right?" "Just a slip," she said, leaving her hand on his arm a second longer than necessary. "I'm fine." By the time the sun was directly overhead, beating down on the plains, they reached the shade of the cottonwoods. The stream was clear and cold, cutting through the tall grass like a lifeline. Mason let Bramble drink while he filled their canteens. Asha knelt by the water's edge, splashing the cool liquid over her face and neck, washing away the dust and the fear of the last few days. When she stood up, dripping and refreshed, Mason was watching her. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet determination. "We'll make better time on the open plain," he said. "Where are we actually going, Mason?" she asked, drying her hands on her dress. "After the horses are delivered." "What?" Then Mason looked at the water, then back at her. "I was heading north to finish the job. That was the plan." He paused. "But plans change when the road does." Asha stepped closer, searching his face. "Are you saying that for my sake? For both?" He admitted. "I'm tired of walking alone, Asha." The honesty of it struck her. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his forearm. "Then we go north together," she said firmly. "If that's what you want," Mason replied, his voice rough with emotion. "It is." They resumed walking along the stream, but the distance between them had closed. They weren't just two survivors sharing a trail anymore. They were partners moving toward a horizon that finally looked promising. By late afternoon, the terrain shifted again. The endless, flat expanse of the plains gave way to a gentle, rolling rise dotted with twisted juniper trees. The sky had deepened into a rich, dusty blue, stretching wide and cloudless above them. Here, the land felt different, calmer, less exposed, as if the earth itself was exhaling after the heat of the day. Asha slowed her pace, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. It was the quietness of the place that pulled her forward. Her shoulders, which had been hiked up near her ears for days, finally dropped. Mason noticed the change and guided the mare up the final slope, stopping at the crest. Below them lay a small, hidden valley. It was a geological secret, sheltered on 3 sides by high rock walls and open only to the east. A stream wound through the center like a silver ribbon, curving around a patch of flat, grassy ground that looked as though it had been waiting for someone to claim it. It was far from the trade routes, far from the settlements, and far from the war paths. Asha stepped ahead of him, her eyes drinking in the view. "It's peaceful," she whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. "It's forgotten land," Mason replied, stepping up beside her. "Most riders pass within a mile of this place and never know it exists. Do you think it's safe? She asked, turning to him. As safe as anywhere can be in this world, he said, and a hell of a lot easier to defend than the open trail. Asha walked down the slope, moving carefully but without fear. When she reached the stream, she crouched down, trailing her fingers through the water. It was cool and clear. She splashed some onto her face, letting the droplets run down her neck. Mason watched her from the bank, and for the first time since he'd found her hiding behind the waterfall, he saw genuine relief. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a soft, weary hope. She stood up, brushing her wet hands against her leather dress. She looked at the flat patch of ground near the trees, then back at him. I could live here, she said, her voice steady, if that's something we're considering. Mason walked toward her, his boots crunching softly in the grass. I wasn't planning on settling down anywhere, he admitted. I've spent a long time convincing myself that the road was the only home I needed. But, she prompted gently, but plans change, he said, and the road gets lonely. Asha turned to face him fully. The wind caught her drying hair, blowing it across her face, but she didn't look away. She looked stronger now, grounded. Yesterday, I was running for my life, she said. Today, I'm standing in a place that feels like it belongs to someone who survived. You did survive, Mason said firmly. So did you, she replied, even if you don't call it that. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. You helped me when you could have turned away, Mason. I don't forget that. You gave me something to, he said quietly, a reason to stop. Asha held his gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, she reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was a bold move, an anchor dropped in deep water. Mason didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering on her skin. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. Neither are you, he answered. They stood there by the stream, the silence wrapping around them not as a threat, but as a promise. It wasn't the tense, listening silence of the shelter. It was the calm of a decision finally made. If we cleared those loose stones near the tree line, Asha said, looking past him, we could build a foundation, something stronger than a hunter's shack. We can start whenever you want, Mason replied. Today, she said decisively. I want to start today. Mason nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Then today it is. He led Bramble to the shade of a juniper tree and unhitched the tools. Asha didn't wait. She began gathering smaller stones, marking out a perimeter on the flat earth. Her limp was still there, but she moved with purpose. Mason joined her, lifting the heavier rocks that she couldn't manage, setting them in place with a solid thud. They worked in tandem, passing stones and clearing brush without needing to speak. The sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting the valley in a warm, golden glow. Mason straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow, and watched Asha adjust a row of stones. She was building a home, stone by stone, and he realized he was doing the same. You sure about this? He asked one last time. Asha looked up, her hands dusted with earth. Yes, are you? He stepped closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. I am. As the twilight deepened, they sat by a new fire. The outline of their future home marked in the dirt behind them. They had found safety. They had found a place to belong. And most importantly, they had found each other. The running was over. The building had begun.